Welcome to the second in the fall briefing series, Crossing the Digital Divide. First, I'd like to thank our partner, DLT, a tech data company, for co-hosting this event. The Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, or ICIT, is the nation's leading cybersecurity think tank, providing objective, nonpartisan research, advisory, and education to legislative, commercial, and public sector cybersecurity stakeholders. ICIT programs and initiatives support cybersecurity leaders and practitioners in all 16 critical infrastructures as defined by the Department of Homeland Security and can be leveraged by other community members impacted by the digital adversaries, including small and medium business owners, academia, and other industries impacted by digital threats. Our theme today is the cybersecurity. One of the outcomes of our increasingly interconnected operating environment is the rise in hybrid cybersecurity physical attacks. These hybrid attacks target both cyber and physical assets, blurring operational and cybersecurity strategies. Successful cybersecurity attacks may disrupt or deny critical infrastructure operations, making mitigation a top priority for public and private sector leaders. The 2021 ICIT Fall Briefing Series, in partnership with DLT, is focused on cyber convergence or integrating physical and cybersecurity strategies. CISA, or CISA, depending on how you pronounce it, suggests that business leaders develop a holistic security strategy that aligns cybersecurity and physical security functions. By bringing together top public and private sector leaders, ICIT is advancing the conversation about the importance of protecting our nation's critical infrastructures by hosting thought-provoking dialogue about the impact of cyber physical attacks. Our topic, securing the perimeter, reconciling zero trust and the expanding attack surface. Our panelists for this session are Greg Sisson, CISO for Department of Energy, Major Steve Whittam, research scientist, Army Cyber Institute, West Point Military Academy, Renata Spinks, Chief Technology Officer, U.S. Marine Corps, Don McLean of DLT, a tech data company, Chief Cybersecurity Technologist, and Chris Roberts, Federal Technology Director, Quest Software Public Sector. And I am your moderator for today, Joyce Hunter, and I am the ICIT Director. We hope that you will gain the following outcomes: gain executive insights on applying the zero trust mindset to physical and digital perimeter security, understand how the increasing attack surface and industry shifts, such as work from home or BYOD, may impact your perimeter, understanding the overlap between the CIA triad and zero trust principles for positioning your organization's zero trust adoption, discussing how the implementation requirements from Executive Order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity, apply to the private sector, and Internet actionable recommendations for mitigation and integrating cyber risk strategies in your organizations. Let's get started. So, Greg, I'm going to address this to you first, but I want everybody to join in, and please make this interactive. To level set, what challenges are you encountering in legacy or industrial control systems, and did the explosive increase in interconnectivity change that definition?
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. Appreciate it. So good afternoon, everyone. So I think it really depends on the function of the control systems that we're talking about. Most of what we do in Department of Energy is related to electrical transmission systems and substations. And those are managed by our power marketing administrations. With control systems, we're often not concerned as much about the data as we are about availability of those systems. So availability is the #1 priority. #2 is data integrity, and then lastly is confidentiality. In many cases, we're not really looking at data directly from the endpoints. So we look at we look at this differently than we do from legacy or from traditional IT. We're really abstracting data and putting it into a modeling or management system. And in many cases, the last mile is serial connectivity, and it's resistant to management and visibility. Or I'm sorry, it's resistant to management and visibility that we're looking at for zero trust. In the bulk electric sector, there's also significant regulatory hurdles that we have to overcome. And unfortunately, so right now, with even though the executive order 14028 talks a lot about moving to a zero trust architecture, our power marketing administrations have to stay in lockstep with NERC, with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, who is starting to look at the zero trust framework and figuring out how they can implement portions of that. But right now, they're still really focused on and regulated by maintaining a strong defensive perimeter. So we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at, I think that's probably the biggest challenge that we face when we look at control systems versus traditional information technology.
Anybody else want to weigh in here?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the Department of Defense Marine Corps, of course, we have our industrial systems as well. And I think the challenge for us has been probably mitigated as the way we partner with NSA and that operational approach that they use. I kind of like to call it not connected to our enterprise network. Now, there are some connectivities, there's some logging that occurs, there's some security protocols that we use, but they are very different than what Marine Corps would refer to as our business operation systems, as well as our tactical environment. So when we think about industrial control systems, I like to kind of refer to it as the liability and regulatory challenges we have at the federal level. So partner that with private industry regulations, and you have a web of opportunity, right? And a web of challenges that I think are so sophisticated as you look across and hear things like ransomware attacks. You hear, things like the water systems being infiltrated. So those things to try to help everyone kind of understand it and bring it home. When you start to cross over into the federal space, not only do we have to coordinate with state and local, government, but we also have those federal regulations that we have to adhere to, and congressional and senatorial challenges. So as you look at executive orders and we look at infrastructure, there's a lot of things there to consider. So I think Greg hit it right on the nail when he talked about the different bodies who are interested in how we execute and implement.
Now, Greg, let me ask you a question. You have the national labs. Do they fall under a different area than the regular Department of Energy? And I know that you also have to deal with some state and local entities.
Yeah, no, the national laboratories they're federally funded, contract managed. They manage federal systems. So they're held to the same standards that everybody else is that manages federal systems. Now they'll have other systems that they manage as a laboratory, but for the most part, those are still federal systems, and they're held to the same standards
Great.
that everybody else is that manages federal systems. And really, the interface that we have with state and local is done by an organization called CSER. It's Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. That's an assistant secretary organization that was stood up a couple years ago, specifically to interface with and perform the duties of the Sector Risk Management Agency for energy and interface with the private energy sector.
Great. Thank you very much. So go ahead. Okay.
Well,
So go ahead.
I was going to jump in actually. So talking about the regulatory space, to further complicate things. So at the Army Cyber Institute, we've been working on a critical infrastructure project called Jack Voltaic. And one of the more eye-opening findings that we had for our last project was that a lot of the support mechanisms that are in place for public-private, local, municipal level, private sector utilities, a lot of that support mechanism and the policy level is based on requests for support that, depending on the organization, the event, and the state and local laws, may never come. And the reason for that is, just to pick on Georgia, the state of Georgia as an example, they're a home rule state, which means that the governor actually is not allowed to, by law, impose on the local mayoral space unless the mayor specifically requests it. So a lot of those request chains where the local level requests support from the state level, requests support from the federal level, are based on a recognition that there is an issue that they need help dealing with. And we were able to show actually in the exercise that we ran for them back in September 2020 was that a sophisticated adversary can stay below that threshold and keep it rather opaque whether there's a technical problem, meaning equipment malfunction, or if they're externally being manipulated. So taking into account the local laws, regulations, customs, personalities, agreements, it becomes extremely complicated the further down you drill.
Yeah, I am sure it does, and it's all about politics when it comes down to it.
Hey, Joyce, it's Chris. So I want to bring it back to your original question you posed to Greg around industrial controls. And I think when we think about industrial controls, we often think maybe, oh, it's just going to turn the thermostat up or down, which is our our most convenient way of thinking about industrial control. But for the layperson, that's probably a great analogy. I always think about two specific cases, and one was a software attack and one was a specific industrial control attack. The software attack was the Shamoon attack on Saudi Aramco, where they targeted the Win32 kernel, and that actual piece of malware would actually work to detect whether it was a 32-bit kernel or a 64-bit kernel before it actually dropped its payload. And then it would infect a workstation that actually controlled the controls within the pipeline system. And then we have Stuxnet, which was specifically designed for the PLC controllers manufactured by Siemens for a certain country's centrifuge operation. So when you think about industrial controls, the hack gets more sophisticated depending on the operator. So if it's a very persistent threat or an advanced persistent threat adversary, for instance, they're going to spend the time and money to understand exactly what specifically in that system they're going to attack. They won't do it willy-nilly, for instance. The most recent example, Colonial Pipeline, I think that was more of a ransomware spread across specific workstations. But I think when we get to industrial controls, now we're getting to a level of sophistication where someone is actually doing a lot of advanced work to figure out exactly what controls are actually being used, what versions of software, for instance, right down to logic controllers. And that's when we're really in trouble, because then those systems don't just need to be isolated. We need to have some system of trust for those devices before we decide whether or not to let packets from that control to or from that control actually propagate through our network. So it's more complicated, but I think it's going to kind of think our conversations go this way: is how do we trust these devices once they're activated on our networks?
Thank you. That was great. Yes.
And also, as Greg alluded to, the difference in priorities, for ICS or IoT folks versus, IT folks like me, we're concerned with the C and the I, the confidentiality, integrity. They're more concerned with the availability, and in both cases, that's rational. However, the bad actors don't make such distinctions, and we've seen attacks where they don't even attack the ICS or IoT system itself really specifically, but just use that to leverage into some more high value target that they're after. So as these systems converge on a technical level, we have to be aware of the culture clash between the IT and the IoT security folks, but also realize that an attack on one could well be an attack on the other, a way of leveraging it into the other system. The silver lining, although it's not a good one really, is that perhaps, with these kinetic attacks reaching people's pocketbooks, I mean, there was a spike in gas prices, might, force or trigger, the electorate to put pressure on their government to be, more stringent about cybersecurity. which I think would be useful. You know,
Yeah.
people tend to think of it as abstract bits and bytes, and oh, you know, so what? It doesn't really hurt me, you know. But if they have to pay more at the gas pump, or there's some physical, you know, if the water's not running, all of a sudden people are going to put a high priority on cybersecurity. So that's not a good way to get it done, but. You know.
Absolutely. And if people don't start getting their Christmas packages because of supply chain, there are going to be a lot of unhappy people out here at Christmas.
That's going to be a priority.
Okay. So Greg and Don, what do you consider to be the most significant drivers for the vanishing security perimeter? Don, we'll start with you.
Well, I don't think it's any big secret that it's really the two main trends that were in existence before the pandemic were work from home and cloud adoption that have caused the perimeter to become less and less well defined. And of course, the pandemic vastly and exponentially accelerated the work from home factor of that. So I think those are the main driving factors in the dissolving or disappearing perimeter. I think it's important to keep in mind was in the title of this event, which is the expanding attack surface. As the perimeter it gets less and less well defined, the attack surface expands. And I've read some academic literature on what exactly the attack surface is, but really it was just a lot of elaborate stuff saying all the places they can get you. It's really what it boils down to. I mean, I well remember the days when I used to do assessments of systems in the government, and step one was always to establish the system boundary. And usually that was just a physical boundary. Just here's the point of presence in the computer room, and boom, that's where responsibility ends. And it's not that way anymore at all. It's really a scope of responsibility, and I think one of the main things that was difficult, even within a well-defined physical parameter, was to determine exactly where the sensitive data really lived and where it's legitimately flowing to and from. And with the disappearing perimeter, that's even more difficult now. I mean, is it did your 9-year-old son come in and plug the USB into your work while you weren't looking, and now all of a sudden you've got federal contract information on his Game Boy? That's exaggeration, but you know what I mean. It's that much more difficult to determine where the assets are, which
Absolutely.
I think the corollary of the disappearing perimeter. It's like, where is our stuff? So, but I'll let Greg take over. Catch him. Okay.
Yeah. No, I not much to add to that. I really do think it comes down to the advanced adversaries, the ever-expanding attack surface, and the sophistication of attacks. I think that's really what I think has driven us, to get away from a traditional perimeter. I mean, almost everything is encrypted now. You can't rely on just traditional net flow data, to find adversaries on your perimeter defenses. You've got to do it down at the endpoint, because that's where you're going to find it. So I really do think that Don did a good job of describing that, and those are the only things I would add.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great.
Give somebody else an opportunity.
Hey, one thing I think is important to note is not just the pandemic and the increase of working from home, but before the pandemic, what we experienced within the Marine Corps was the need to fund in response to national disasters. And so when hurricanes and tornadoes occur, when cities that are states that freeze, that like in Texas, that usually never freeze, and so it continues to cause an increase of cost, then that money is coming from somewhere. Right. And so most times for Marine Corps, we were in the middle of infrastructure upgrades for legacy technology that had been in place 10, 15, 20 years. And so I have a workforce that's accustomed to on premises, and now you're saying we're moving to the cloud, we're going to someone else's house. And so now you can't tell me how to secure the house, but now you have to figure out how do you secure the data in someone else's house. So that's like me coming to your home, Joyce, and telling you, I'm going to put my furniture in your house. And then I got to try to figure out, well, how do I make sure that Joyce secures my furniture, right?
Right.
So that's the big challenge that I saw, was the reduction of how we spend. And one thing that we've talked about a lot for Marine Corps, that I've continued to drumbeat is we got to figure out, how do we fund the way we fight? Because what you see is an acquisition program that's not keeping up with the pace of technology. These 3 and 5 and 10-year contracts that don't consider the ability and need to pivot when not only the adversary becomes more sophisticated, but I would submit there's the level of sophistication, but then there's also a level of simplicity, because when you look at some of the large scale attacks that have occurred, the avenue of entry or the anatomy of attack has been the password is wrong, or a password is so easy to guess, capital P @ symbol sign SSWORD. On some of the most critical assets or the most critical administrative avenues into your network.
Yeah.
So it's more of, is it a sophisticated attack? Yes. But is the level of attack or the entry of attack so sophisticated? And so that's my favorite word to talk through, which is we have a level of technical complacency that we have to figure out, how do we address that? How do we incentivize a workforce that is overworked, right? And sometimes we have that instant gratification or demand and user experience that takes priority. So we take shortcuts. And so those are conversations that we don't have a whole lot of, but it is very impactful when we think about it. We have the way we fund. We got to figure out how we fight and how we fund is something we definitely got to look at. But how do we incentivize the partnerships with industry, as well as contractual personnel who work on our networks, as well as our workforce, to increase the way we support securing what is no longer a perimeter?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
If I can build on something Renata just said, she talked about shortcuts, and that's, in IT, we're well known for taking shortcuts, especially developers. I will cop to that in a minute. However, the shortcuts come up from an innate desire in both public and private consumers for convenience, and that convenience has driven a lot of convergence in our industry. So for instance, in the old days, a traditional hack or old school hack would be siphoning fuel during the gas crisis, if y'all can remember back in those days, and then or stealing internet, or excuse me, cable from your neighbor, for instance, or electricity. It was easy to lock those things down because you had a very controlled access point for those services. But for instance, when we designed, or when DARPANET was designed, it was designed as a resilient network that could withstand EMP or a nuclear attack. Now it's the commercial and public internet. And now we're trying to figure out how to lock down something that wasn't supposed to be open in the first place. So that's why we have things like zero trust and least privilege and credentials and multi-factor. We're constantly bolting on security to these environments. But the attack surface, quite frankly, I think the perimeter disappeared the minute we turned computers on. The minute we turned on the internet, the perimeter literally disappeared. So now the question really is, if the perimeter is gone, what are we trying to protect? And in my philosophy, when I think about things, we're trying to protect data, we're trying to protect information, and that information can literally reside anywhere. Today it's on networks and computers, it's on IoT devices, but soon it'll be on those Amazon drones that are flying around your house, for instance. It's the drone, or it's your Tesla car, or your Mach-E from Mustang, for instance. There's so many different devices that are going to be holding data. How do we now protect data? And we're getting to the point where it's not just enough to encrypt what encapsulates and transports our data, but literally the data itself, so it's actually mapped to the device or even the person in which it's intended to. Don't even get to Star Trek, but I think we're going to get there at some point.
Yeah, I do too. I wholeheartedly agree with you there. Thank you very much. This was a very robust conversation on this particular question. Well,
Chris,
go ahead.
sorry, Joyce. I read just a little bit when Chris said, well, we're trying to protect data. Well, that's true, but I'm wondering about Greg thinking about his industrial control systems, which are less about the data and more about, the sensors and actuators that actually make things go boom.
Mhm.
So there's more than just the data out there, Chris. You're speaking like an
I know, but data controls those devices, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That's what I'm talking about.
If there's no 0 or 1, that spigot
Yeah.
doesn't turn.
Then we're in trouble.
You know what I mean?
And,
Yeah.
all right, Don, that's a conversation for bourbon and beer, baby.
But what about people who don't drink bourbon and don't drink beer?
We do pina coladas too.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, while NIST released the Zero Trust framework in 2020, Google implemented Zero Trust effectively before that. So what factors do you think made the Google implementation effective? And what lessons can be learned by leaders to take from their implementation? Whoever wants to start, Major Whittam?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one first. So first and foremost, Google started their transition as a function of their emerging operational requirements. They were going to a mobile workforce back in the early 10s, so well before COVID accelerated that process. And I think all of my fellow panelists have touched on this to some degree, but I really wanted to key in on this one. Fund as we fight. Protect our data. All of these statements talking about securing our operations in progress. I mean, Chris gave a really good short synopsis history lesson of the 69 implementation of ARPANET versus the 91 distribution of the commercial internet. And a lot of our critical infrastructure was built in the 70s and 80s before security was even a thing. So when you talk about Google's implementation, they were trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to secure our operations? It was an operationally focused implementation. And I think that is the key, right? One of the key elements that they applied in their implementation was they wanted to make sure that the only devices that could access their internal microservices were Google devices. Well, what does that require? It requires an accurate inventory of your devices. And that was actually a surprising hiccup for them. They didn't realize that their inventory was not in great shape. So you had a lot of people who had Google devices who couldn't access the resources that they needed to work because the devices weren't properly inventoried. Similarly, you had devices that had been serviced out who were still on the inventory. And so they had a lot of dead space for acceptable entries to receive those resources. So that would be the lesson that I would suggest to take the opportunity when you do your Zero Trust implementation, identify how you plan to operate, secure that, and take the opportunity while you're there to fix other kind of nagging issues that you may have operationally. But it should be operationally focused. Availability is very important to the operational folks. They want to make sure that the devices that they're using work.
Mm-hmm.
The security of that cannot be secondary, but it also can't interfere. But here's an analogy that I would like to draw. In the Army, we plan foot marches. Well, the foot march to the range that's located on base is a very, very different foot march with a different planning timeline for how fast you can move than a foot march to an objective in a hostile zone under fire. Right? You don't plan the foot march in the hostile zone and then figure out how to secure it. You plan the foot march with security in mind so that you have some, reasonable expectation of actually getting there. So I think that's the key, operational focus.
I'm going to use that analogy. That's a great one. I haven't heard that one before, but boy, it really hits the nail on the head. I think, Google's BeyondCorp, one of the big lessons I would suggest to derive from that is that Zero Trust is a real thing. I mean, you hear a lot of abstraction and a lot of frameworks and a lot of philosophizing and, trust but verify, assume breach, and so on and so forth. And those are all valid places to start. But I think the biggest lesson from Google BeyondCorp is that it's a real thing and it can actually be done. The second lesson I would derive is keying off of what Major Whittam said is, the inventory was an essential element of this. I would argue that all of the foundational elements of security need to be solidly in place. And that includes things like knowing people's job functions. If you're going to implement least privilege, how do you know what they really need to do to get their job done, and what is really just excessive and just an ego boost for that person? And to that end, you're going to need to acknowledge that there's a cultural impact on this. As a security person or an IT person, you don't know really what they need to do to get their job done. They know better than you do. So you're, to try to argue against them, you're in a position of weakness. You need to get them as allies to say, hey, or management to say, hey, you know what, this is what people really need, and this is what these are the privileges that we can really pull away. You also need to be able to do, as Major Wynn said, the inventory is not a trivial thing, and it's even more difficult quite often in an IoT or ICS environment. I remember talking to someone who was running security at DHA, Defense Health Agency, or is it administration? Anyway, it's always an acronym, so it doesn't really matter. But she told me that they had 220,000 makes and models of devices that they had to be responsive. That's makes and models, not individual instances. And frequently they were not online. So how are you to know what's valid and what's not when a defibrillator comes online once every 3 weeks for 10 minutes? You save someone's life and then it goes back in the closet. I mean, that's just an example. So the inventory can be that's not a trivial issue by any means. And then of course inventorying the data itself, as I alluded to earlier, is also more difficult. So I think that the lessons are you can do it, it's possible. Focus on the foundations and the fundamentals such as inventory, knowing people's job functions for real, and understanding that some of these things may not be as easy as you would think on the surface. So,
Very true.
Hey, I'd like to weigh in a little bit on a couple areas of focus where we talk about before security was a thing, and I hear that a lot, and so I want to be a little bit of a disruptor right now, as we really think about before security was a thing. And so I would urge, or I would challenge us to really think, hasn't security always been a thing, right? I think it's more of before we really started to prioritize security, right? Because security, I think, has always been a thing, and I'll tell you why. We have been doing PIN numbers, ATMs, and bank account information since I can remember. Even as a little girl, when my daddy was teaching me how to drive, I had a little ATM card that I had to go and get money out of an ATM because I didn't know that there was a difference between a debit card and the ATM, right? But even then it was login, name, password, PIN number. I even remember one time that there was an ability to create a passphrase. So I think security has always been with us. And I think the banking industry is probably the dinosaur to zero trust. I think they've been doing zero trust for a very long time. It's just another thing that we've called it, right? So when I think of it that way, I think that we've had security at the forefront of our thought process. There has just been a challenge to prioritize security away from my favorite C word, complacency. As technology has emerged and continued to modernize, there are some areas where I think we just continue to accept a little bit more risk, and it's catching up with us now.
Mm-hmm. And I'm
disruptor of the panel.
If I could jump in on the financial sector, Ms. Spinks is absolutely correct. The financial sector left zero trust. They've had it implemented for a long time, and the things that they're doing now have left that. They're solving tomorrow's problems because they are constantly under attack. One of the things that I came across, which I found absolutely fascinating, and I haven't found in any of the other sectors whether this could apply. So there's a system that they put in place called Sheltered Harbor, which essentially is that the financial institutions have an incentive to back up each other's data.
Yes.
If you're Wells Fargo and you're doing a transaction with Bank of America, you both have an incentive for each other's data to be accurate. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that this works in every other sector, but this is a case where a sector-specific operational need drives how they perform their security and, more importantly, in their case, resilience. You could completely wipe out a partner data. They could be reduced to absolutely 0 bits. All of their data could be gone, and it could be back up tomorrow because all of the other institutions that you didn't get to are backing up their data.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now I think that, like you said, Ms. Banks, security has always been with us, but now it's the convergence of physical, because the physical security, is always, you go on base, you have to show ID or whatever. And so physical security has always been with us, but now it's the convergence of the physical and the logical that makes a lot of sense. I had the great opportunity a couple of weeks ago to talk with Chief Kathy Lanier, who is the CISO of the NFL.
Yeah.
And you talk about the convergence between the two and the challenges that she has to face between communicating with state and local, as well as the fans, as well as the players, and it's a big job.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think of physical security and converging, and as we looked at from a defense perspective, you looked at 9/11 and the unfortunate events there, and how the Department of State and the state and local had to look at how we are communicating our identities.
Mhm.
The ability to get a driver's license or a state ID card has become horrendous now because of those events where driver's licenses were able to easily be acquired at that time. And so you think about all those things, and you think about, the different systems that we have in place, the financial industries. I think it's been around for a long time, and it's taken people like us to continue to foot stomp the things we're learning, those different lessons learned, not to ever take away from Google, because what Google solved was a problem outside of the financial sector. It was in a space where user experience was able to be prioritized, and the ability to flow of information, right? And so the financial sector is not really about flowing information and user experience. That's about, making funds available and your ability to use those funds. So I definitely love the two different constructs solving the same problem.
Great. So Major Whittam, talking about physical and cybersecurity, merging them at an organizational level is still relatively uncommon. And I think, Ms. Banks, you can answer this too, because you're with the Marine Corps as well, and you have to do both. What is the best way to foster a convergent strategy that encompasses physical security and cybersecurity at an organizational level?
Yeah, well, I don't know if this is necessarily the best way, but it's effective for our organization, small as it is. Our IT team has on its staff also our cybersecurity team, also our physical security team, also our clearance team. So that office, they have their own physical security, they have their own door, their own passcodes and everything, but they control access to the building, they control access to the data centers, they manage all of the accounts. So that office is completely 100% integrated. And oh, by the way, for the Army Cyber Institute, we work hand in hand with the United States Military Academy, and we receive support and provide support back and forth. So, but those people who are in there, they also have advanced degrees, and so they understand, for us as researchers, what the research process is like. So they have a really, good understanding of how we operate. And that would be how I would suggest. I mean, our organization is only 65 people, so it's it's a little bit easier in that regard. But synchronizing those activities and not treating them as completely separate disciplines. I think that what Ms. Binks said is 100% correct. We want to draw the distinction between physical security and cybersecurity. The truth is, it's just security. And the principles apply in both. It's just how you solve. I mean, you're not going to solve the digital portion of the security thing with physical doors, but you have to solve the digital portion of the security thing with the digital door opener that reads my ID card, right? They cannot be. You can't treat them as separate disciplines anymore, or at least you cannot treat them as separate offices, each with their own organizational requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think making making the jump to using agility within the Department of Defense during this past pandemic was something the Marine Corps executed, and it was unprecedented, had never been done before. But we were forced to use the SAFE construct and pull together, you know, agile release trains and have process owner and business owner and the security personnel there and agile coaches and scrum masters. We were forced to do so because number one, we were on stop move and we were at 10 and 15 and 20% manning. And so you didn't have all of the personnel that you needed. So you had to come out of the silos to get to a place where our workforce could work from home in a distributed manner, in a space where we could control the level of risk that we were accepting, right?
Yeah.
So that was the first thing, coming out of those silos. But the second piece was, in order to come out of the silos, I think Greg mentioned that word, it starts with a C, but it's not complacency. He mentioned culture. And if you don't think differently, you will continue to solve the problems the same way. So part of thinking differently is our commandant is really focused on talent management. On the civilian space, you know, he likes to say, you know, the person you may need with the expertise may not have 15 or 20 years of the Marine Corps behind his belt. I mean, Ms. Spink doesn't have Marine Corps experience except the 3 years she's been here. I have Army background, but just having these most recent two commandants have that conversation about going into the colleges, and maybe you're looking at a kid that's, you know, creating graphical images on a computer, and maybe he is a graphics designer, or maybe she is a content manager, but that expertise is still valuable within an area where we have a gap of talent, which is in the information space, right? Not just cybersecurity, but sometimes there are gaps in developers because most developers, some great developers are being, you know, highly recruited for some of the more sophisticated development spaces. So thinking differently and understanding how to recruit and manage our talent on both the military side and civilian. And we had to come out of silos. And one last piece that I want to just kind of have everyone just kind of think about is the one thing that we look at from an acquisition perspective is engaging more with industry and creating those partnerships. And customarily, there's a culture of not engaging with industry and challenges with acquisition, and, oh, you can't talk to the vendor because of preferential treatment and different things like that. And so we have to think differently because industry has two things that the Department of Defense and the government doesn't have. One is a whole lot more research and development capacity to go out there and learn some things. So we can definitely learn from consortiums and resource centers, et cetera. But the second one is we have taxpayers. We don't have stakeholders. And if you really think about that, there is some things that we could really take better advantage of when we understand that there's a level of security for a stakeholder that may be a little different for us who are funded by taxpayers. It shouldn't be that way, but those are just the facts. Of course, I'm the disruptor of the panel. So.
Chris, tell me, what recommendations would you give leaders when they are planning their converged cyber physical strategy?
Come off mute. And I think early in the conversation, we talked about the Google analogy about how they deployed their Beyond Core and their Zero Trust, and the problems they realized around inventory. And the trouble is that our current systems, whether they're change management, whether they're inventory from a software or hardware inventory, these are all separate and disparate systems. For instance, Major Whitman mentioned about, accessing, key cards or door panels, for instance. Renata, you mentioned banks and ATMs, for instance. These are all physical devices that have some sort of access mechanism to them. Inherently now, it's some things that are going to be offline inherently in perpetuity. For instance, my garage door is offline. I am not putting a smart garage door opener on my house. I'm sorry. I don't trust randomized, code generators. I'm sorry. My point is that as you go through your physical as well as your digital infrastructure, the physical infrastructure is a little bit more hands-on. You may have to send out field teams to literally verify that device is exactly where it is you think it is. It has the right serial number, the model number. You understand exactly what it does, for instance, and you collect some sort of data around that. You start to think about industrial controls, and Don mentioned this earlier. It's like, yes, industrial controls are not about data, it's about reliability, for instance. Now, that's even more important, for instance. Did Colonial Pipeline know where every valve was, for instance, what version of valve that was, or what model number it was, or which manufacturer? Think of your home. Do you have all the same faucets in your house? Some are Moen, some are, Pfizer, Pfister. You have different devices. So the hardest part about physical security is inventory, is what is actually out there, for instance. I think it gets easier as we move away from certain legacy technologies. For instance, I think Tesla has an incredible advantage in the EV space because they design a car from platform to driveway and everything in between. So they know exactly what's in that vehicle, for instance. It's not that convenient with an agency. If I look at IRS, 400 different types of specific little systems that have code that goes back to the 70s, and it's still using COBOL in some cases. So I think the hardest part is to understand not just what you have, but what's it running, what's the version, and be able to understand and answer all those questions about what it is, what does it know, where is it, and how does it connect. And I think then you can start to formulate a strategy. Is okay, now how do I protect all these things? And it's not just one solution. It's not just zero trust. It's not BeyondCorp. It's a lot of things we have to consider basically to secure that integration of those devices and systems. Don.
Absolutely. And can you imagine, I came from agriculture, 27 agencies, staff offices, and mission areas, things are so different as forest service, rural development, so I know what you're talking about, Chris. Thank you so very much. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, let me take a moment, and I think Chris has this wonderful way of just summarizing things beautifully. I'm going to expand on something he said, but I'm also going to pull it back to, we're talking about zero trust, and the definitions of those words. Trusting your internal network, trusting your own devices as much as you trust the external network or the external devices, meaning not at all, right? So if we're talking about the perimeter, we're talking about the attack surface, and we're talking about trust levels, part of the reason why the attackers have had such an advantage is they figure out a way to understand your system better than you do in one key area. They don't have to understand the entirety of your system better than you, but if they can understand one small subset better than you do, and they can trigger the correct domino to achieve their effect, they win. So what Chris just talked about with inventorying your data, inventorying your devices, understanding your own space. If you don't know your own technologies better than your adversary will always have the advantage. Even if you go through all of these technical and cultural controls, you have to understand your own space.
And we'll just add to that in a microservices architecture, you also need to have a clear inventory of all the microservices that are out there, so they mutually authenticate. And that's where a service mesh can come in real handy. So it's yet another thing to inventory and keep track of.
Yeah. Well, before we chime out on this one, for all the viewers that are maybe actually get a chance to stumble across this webinar, the one thing you can do for yourselves is to understand this on a personal level, is when you get home, access your router's control interface, whether it's Xfinity, Verizon, Fios, whatever it is, and just look at all the IP addresses of the things that are on your home network, and then ask yourself, do you know what each one of those things are, what they're doing, and how they're protected? And then you start to understand the magnitude of what any commercial or government public sector organization has to deal with. I do this on occasion, and I'm always surprised to find an IP address that I had, like, what exactly is that? And I find out my kid, put a Alexa smart plug in the house somewhere, and I'm like, that not authorized. That's coming out.
Chris,
so it's an exercise that everybody needs to do, but it'll give you a great perspective on how hard it is out there.
Yeah.
That's actually me messing with your garage door opener, Chris. So.
Yeah.
From a management perspective, Don, since we're picking on you, how would you position implementing and benchmarking your organizational zero trust efficacy?
Well, One of the things that's been interesting lately is the whole concept of security metrics, which I used to think was just sort of a hopeless exercise, but I think there's more possibility there. And in order to implement a zero trust program, you need to get stakeholders at all levels and from all areas in the organization, as we talked about earlier, because it's a cultural shift. The way you demonstrate the value of what you're doing is through, or one way to demonstrate the value of what you're doing is through the use of some specific specific metrics to show that the program is actually working and yielding some results. You can't just sit there and be a cheerleader and say, hey, we're zero trust now, aren't we special? We're buzzword compliant and everything, right? And some of the specific metrics that you can look at, and I mean, you can do this whether you're doing zero trust or not, look at the devices. Well, as Chris was just saying, look what's on your network. Can you identify everything? As your zero trust program progresses, are you able to eliminate the unidentified devices on your internal network? How many intrusion attempts are you getting, and how many are you rebuffing? What's your mean time to detect, contain, and resolve all of these attempted intrusions? There's also the patching cadence. How quickly are you able to patch and bring things up to date? Now, I know patching kind of got a black eye with the whole SolarWinds thing, but it's still not a bad idea to keep things patched and up to date. And then, finally, there are security rating tools that you can do on a very broad risk management level. Various tools, and BitSight is one. I mean, just full disclosure, that's a company DLT does business with, and we sell their products, but there's another called UpGuard and various ones, just to see if your security rating on a very broad strokes is improving over time. So any of these metrics, and I attended a session recently in Seattle on security metrics, and the speaker made the distinction between a measurement and a metric. He said a measurement is a point in time, and a metric is over time. And he said, the important thing is what happens over time. Okay, we had 400 intrusion attempts last month. What does that mean? Is it going up or down? What matters is the ability to measure these things to see if they're moving in the right direction. So I would say that that's one essential element that's going to help you convince all of the managerial and financial folks, and also the security folks and the IT folks who are involved in a zero trust program to believe that your program is showing tangible, measurable results. The old SMART thing, specific, measurable, attainable, and whatever R&T stands for. R is T is time bound. I forget what R is. But, so you want to have the concrete measurements that over time that really show the progress of your project, and that's where the NSA guidance comes in. There's a lot of agencies spitting out all sorts of guidance. One of the things I like about the NSA guidance is they take a maturity model approach, so that you can go in phases. Say how mature is our zero trust program at this point? Yeah, we've achieved phase one. We're not just trying to boil the ocean here. We're taking it steps at a time. So
Great.
My story, and I'm sticking to it.
Absolutely. I think what the phased approach does, it gives you that opportunity to get better, and it also gives you the opportunity to learn, fail fast, learn some more, and consistently get better. But I want to just kind of talk through how Marine Corps is just kind of looking at what is the pivot to zero trust. It's sometimes you hear people say, oh, we're doing zero trust, and the first thing I say is, oh, okay, well, how are you doing zero trust? It's not a destination, right? So it's trying to make sure that we all are understanding the thing that Don just talked about, that space of understanding is not just buzzword compliancy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you look at it, and Major General Lieutenant General Glavy, he's most recently promoted, we talk about having a different kind of mindset. And so we go from convenience mindset and instant gratification to every one of us as leaders and boots on the ground, as we like to call it, should start to try and understand how to have a data science mindset, and not just leave it up to data scientists to sift through all the data, identify trends, create data visualizations with many different tools. But as leaders, be thirsty for data and to understand your decision space should be based on data and not assumptions. And that's more laborious than difficult, right? Inventory is more laborious. It's a very laborious action. And it's simple to do, but it takes a lot of time. It's a thoughtless thing of, you can use technology. Chris talked about sometimes you have to deploy teams to actually go and actually physically inventory certain activities. And so we definitely have to be able to be more data centric on our mindset for decision making.
Yeah, I'm going to play off what Don talked about maturity models, and there's one maturity model, I'm not even sure if it's measured, but that's the maturity of the attitude within organizations, of the people themselves towards security. And I measure sometimes this maturity by the level of angst at the introduction of another security measure. So think of us first having to use keys to get into the building, then card keys or CAC. Then we had turnstiles, then we had facial recognition, then we had two-factor, multi-factor, fingerprint. And with each additional security layers, like, did the level of angst go up or down? And what I'm noticing, at least in my organization, some that I work with, is that it's starting to go down. It's that people just are like, oh yeah, it's security. We need to be doing this. But I don't think there's an argument anymore about security. I think their argument now is how convenient can we make it? How seamless can we make it? How consistent can we make it over time? As Don said, not just a measurement, but that metric of consistency over time to make sure that everyone's falling in line with the attitude around maturity for security.
I think that's an excellent statement into our last question, because we are 4 minutes out here. So for everybody, how do leaders balance implementing zero trust, mission requirements, and competing priorities outside of financing?
I'll take that one because my answer is pretty short. We don't. For Marine Corps, there's no balance. We have effectively moved to a space of prioritization. We do a lot of dependency mapping. We do a lot of identifying enablers and what we need to do to set conditions. And then we prioritize. And yes, after we have those priorities, we use an agile approach to give us that flexibility of needing to pivot when necessary.
Okay. Greg?
Yeah, I agree. It's all about risk management and prioritization. It's not, balancing, implementing zero trust. I mean, using zero trust as a framework to guide, what you're planning to do and everything is very important. But when it comes down to it, nobody's going to have all the resources needed to do everything. So, having a solid risk management plan, quantifying it when possible, and then working off of that, I think is the most important thing.
Great. Major Whittam.
I'm going to paraphrase Sun Tzu on two quotes. If you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will win all the time. If you know only your enemy or only yourself, you will win some of the time. And if you know neither, you will lose all of the time. The other one is the victorious warrior wins first and then goes to war, and the defeated warrior goes to war hoping to win. When you talk about zero trust and you talk about risk management, understand that there is no destination. It's going to be a process. This is a set of principles that you have to continually reevaluate yourself on. Are you trusting the external network and the internal network the same? Are you expecting to be compromised? Do you have the ability to recover from an attack? Can you maintain operational uptime while also protecting the data? Those are questions that you have to continue to ask, and the only people who are going to have the answer to that question are you and the folks who basically perform your organization's operational duties. You can go to a vendor and you can talk about zero trust, you can talk about technical solutions, and they're all valid to solve specific problems. But if they don't solve your problems, then it's an invalid solution for you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And last but not least, our program's partners. We'll start with Chris.
Well, I think one of the most important things is the people factor. I think organizations often prioritize around their own goals. And I think you always have to consider the people factor within this. And as I said earlier, is that the maturity of users and citizens is going up around security. I think the very public attacks we've had around pipeline supply chain, for instance, the grid, any time a consumer or a citizen is impacted, they start to understand the ramifications of security. If you ask someone for their Amazon password, they'd look at you like you're crazy, for instance. I also ask my kids not to give out their personal cell phone numbers. And if you've ever done a Google search on someone's cell phone number, likely it turns up their home address, for instance. So I encourage people to always think about security, not from just a revenue or prioritization standpoint, but from a personal security standpoint. Because I think when you make security personal, when you make the ramifications personal to the individual, they take it a lot more seriously than, oh, it might happen to something somewhere across the globe or across town. No, it might happen to me. Therefore, I get in my car and I lock my doors. It's just standard practice. So I always consider the people factor in everything that we do.
And Don, I'll allow you to close it out for us.
Thank you. I think one of the things about zero trust security, or really any major security program, is to understand a lot of these activities can have secondary benefits. For instance, if you do an accurate inventory, that's going to help you manage not just your security, but to manage those assets in a more cost-effective way. If you are able to implement more effective automated response to incidents, you're going to help and this gets to Chris's point about the people factor, that's going to help morale. People aren't frazzled and chasing down incidents as much, and could possibly be reassigned to something more engaging and more interesting, or more essential to the mission of the organization. And we're running short of time, but there are other examples as well. In other words, a lot of these, from a managerial standpoint, a lot of the benefit of zero trust can go beyond simply as a security program.
Thank you very much to our panelists, Major Steve Whittam, Greg Sisson, Don McLean, Renata Spinks, and Chris. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Live long and prosper. Goodbye.
Same to y'all, and thanks to everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.